The cold was not merely a temperature in the high peaks of the Obsidian Mountains. It was a living, breathing malice. It possessed teeth of ice and a patience that outlasted any mortal beast. It gnawed at Eira's extremities first, stealing sensation from her fingertips and toes, before working its way inward to the marrow, whispering seductive promises of a sleep that would never end. Eira huddled deeper into the fissure of the rock, pulling her tattered fur cloak tighter around a frame that had grown alarmingly thin over the last 3 days. The cave was little more than a jagged scar in the mountainside, a shallow depression hidden behind a veil of frozen scrub and accumulated snowdrifts. It smelled of damp stone and old earth, a scent that was currently the only thing grounding her to reality as the blizzard raged outside, screaming like 1,000 dying souls. She should have been terrified of the storm. She should have been terrified of the hypothermia that was slowly turning her blood to slush. But the fear that thrummed in her chest, erratic and violent as a trapped bird, had nothing to do with the elements. The cold was a mercy compared to what hunted her. Foolish, she whispered to herself, her voice a cracked rasp barely audible over the wind. You thought you could outrun the king. It had been madness to run. Everyone in the pack, from the elders to the pups, knew the law. When Alpha King Draven called the mating gathering, attendance was not a request. It was a summons. Draven, the wolf of winter, the butcher of the rebellion, he did not tolerate absence. He did not tolerate defiance. But Eira had felt it the moment the summons arrived, a sickening, heavy pull in her gut. It wasn't just a gathering for him to select a new harem or a political alliance. The pull was specific. It was a biological hook snagged in her soul, tugging her toward the capital, toward him. The bond. She had felt the dormant echo of it, the terrified realization that she, a nobody, a nameless orphan with no lineage and no power, was his. And so, she had run. Not toward him, but away, into the teeth of the worst winter in a decade. Because being the mate of a monster like Draven wasn't a fairy tale. It was a death sentence. Kings didn't have mates. They had possessions. They had weaknesses to be exploited by enemies or trophies to be displayed in gilded cages. A shiver racked her body, so violent her teeth clacked together. She pressed her hands between her thighs, trying to preserve heat. The numbness in her feet was worrying. She couldn't feel her toes anymore. If she stayed here another night, she might lose them. If she left, he might find her. He won't find you, she told herself, a desperate mantra. The snow covers everything. The wind kills the scent. She had been careful. She had walked in freezing streams until her legs went numb to hide her trail. She had rubbed crushed pine needles and bitter herbs over her skin to mask her natural scent. Vanilla and rain. She had moved only during the height of the storm. She was a ghost. She was nothing. But then the wind shifted. It wasn't a sound that alerted her first. It was the silence. The howling gale that had been battering the mountain face suddenly dropped, leaving a vacuum of stillness that was heavier than the noise had been. The air pressure in the cave changed, a subtle pop in her ears, and then came the smell. It hit her like a physical blow to the face, rich, dark, and overwhelming. It smelled of ozone, like the air right before a lightning strike. It smelled of deep, ancient forests and iron. It smelled of absolute power. Eira's heart stopped, then hammered against her ribs with painful force. No! She scrambled backward, pressing her spine against the freezing rock wall until the jagged stone bit into her skin. She held her breath, her eyes wide, staring at the narrow opening of the cave where the gray light of the storm filtered in. A shadow fell across the snow. It wasn't the shapeless shadow of a cloud or a tree. It was distinct, massive. Broad shoulders blocked out the weak winter light, plunging her small shelter into deeper gloom. He didn't enter. He just stood there, just outside the threshold. Eira clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle the whimper that rose in her throat. Her entire body began to tremble, not from cold now, but from a primitive, biological reaction she couldn't control. Her inner wolf was whining, scratching at the back of her mind, desperate to roll over, to submit, to run to him. Traitor, she hissed internally at her beast. He will kill us. The figure outside moved. He crouched. Through the veil of falling snow and the scrub brush she had used to conceal the entrance, she saw a hand reach down. It was a large hand, the skin bronzed and scarred, fingers long and powerful. He wasn't wearing gloves. He didn't seem to feel the cold at all. His fingers brushed the snow just outside her cave entrance. Eira watched in horror as he traced something in the white powder. She squinted, her vision blurring with tears of panic. He was tracing the faint, almost invisible depression where she had stepped hours ago. The wind had filled it, yes, but not enough. Not enough to hide the disturbance in the snowpack from eyes that saw everything. He found the edge of a print. A footprint. Her footprint. The hand paused. Then, slowly, deliberately, he pressed his own palm over the mark she had left, claiming the very ground she walked on. A low sound vibrated through the air. A growl so deep it was felt in the bones rather than heard. It wasn't a growl of anger. It was a growl of satisfaction. Dark, hungry satisfaction. I can hear your heart, little rabbit. A voice drifted into the cave. It was a baritone that wrapped around her spine, smooth as velvet and hard as granite. It was the voice of a man used to being obeyed by armies, by nations, by the elements themselves. It beat so fast, he continued, his tone conversational, terrifyingly calm. Like a bird trapped in a cage. Are you cold? Eira couldn't speak. She couldn't move. She was paralyzed by the sheer weight of his presence. You ran far, Draven said. She could hear the smile in his voice, a cruel, sharp thing. 3 days, through a blizzard that killed 3 of my best trackers. I almost admire it. The shadow shifted. He was standing up. Almost. The temperature in the cave seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant. But you made a mistake, Eira. You thought the snow would hide you. You forgot that winter belongs to me. He stepped into the entrance. The light caught him then. He was terrifying. He was beautiful. His hair was black as a raven's wing, wet with melted snow, falling over eyes that were not human. They were glowing, molten gold, burning with a predatory intensity that pinned her to the wall. He looked at her huddled form, at her trembling hands, at the terror in her eyes, and he didn't look angry. He looked famished. Found you, he whispered. He filled the space. That was the only thought Eira's frozen mind could process. The cave, which had felt like a tomb before, now felt like the inside of a furnace. Draven didn't just occupy the room. He consumed it. The air suddenly tasted of him, crushed pine needles, hot metal, and the terrifying electric scent of ozone that precedes a storm. Eira tried to scramble backward, her boots scraping uselessly against the stone floor. but there was nowhere left to go. Her back was already pressed against the jagged wall. She was cornered, a rabbit staring into the golden eyes of a wolf who had already decided how he would tear her apart. "Stay back," she croaked. Her hand fumbled at her belt, fingers stiff and clumsy as blocks of wood, until they closed around the hilt of the small, rusted skinning knife she had stolen from a trapper's hut 2 days ago. It was a pathetic weapon against a creature like him, a toothpick against a mountain, but it was all she had. Draven's eyes dropped to the trembling blade. He didn't flinch. He didn't even stop moving. He took another step forward, the heavy furs of his cloak brushing against the low ceiling. "Put that away, Eira," he said softly. The command wasn't shouted, but it vibrated in her chest, plucking at her nerves like strings on a harp. "You're barely strong enough to hold it, let alone use it." "I said stay back." She lunged, a desperate feral swipe meant to warn rather than wound. It happened so fast she didn't even see him move. One moment he was standing 3 feet away. The next, his hand was wrapped around her wrist. His grip was iron, immovable and shockingly hot. The heat of his skin seared through her freezing flesh. A contrast so sharp it registered as pain. With a simple, almost lazy twist of his wrist, her fingers sprang open involuntarily. The knife clattered to the stone floor, the sound echoing sharply in the small space. He didn't let go. He pulled her forward, not roughly, but with an inexorable gravity that she couldn't resist. Eira gasped as she collided with his chest. It was like hitting a wall of solid muscle wrapped in velvet and fur. The impact knocked the little remaining breath from her lungs. "Foolish," he murmured, his face lowering toward hers. "So foolish to fight what is already written." Up close, he was devastating. The golden eyes were flecked with darker amber, swirling with an emotion she couldn't name. It wasn't anger, and it wasn't pity. It was possession, pure, unadulterated ownership. He looked at her the way a miser looks at a pile of gold he thought he had lost. "I won't go with you," she whispered, though her traitorous body was already leaning into his warmth, seeking the heat he radiated like a starving man seeks bread. "I won't be one of your things." Draven's other hand came up, his large palm cupping her jaw. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, rough skin against her pale, frozen flesh. The touch sent a jolt of electricity straight down her spine, making her knees buckle. If he hadn't been holding her up, she would have collapsed. "You are not a thing, Eira," he said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a rumble that vibrated through her skull. "And you have no choice about going with me. Look at you. You are dying." It was true. Now that the adrenaline of the initial confrontation was fading, the cold was rushing back in with a vengeance. Her vision was tunneling, black spots dancing at the edges of her sight. Her legs felt like they didn't belong to her anymore. "Better to die free," she slurred, the words thick on her tongue. Draven's expression hardened. The golden light in his eyes flared brighter, almost blinding in the dim cave. "Freedom is a myth for our kind," he growled. "We are all slaves to the moon. And you—" He leaned closer, his nose brushing against her temple, inhaling deeply. "You are slave to something far older than the moon now." He smelled her. He was scenting her. Eira felt a wave of dizziness that had nothing to do with the cold. The scent of him, that intoxicating mix of power and danger, flooded her senses, overriding her fear with a confusing, desperate need. Her inner wolf, usually so quiet and timid, lifted its head and howled in recognition. Mate, mate, mate. No, she whimpered, closing her eyes against the truth. Yes, he whispered against her ear. Before she could protest again, he bent down and swept her into his arms as if she weighed nothing more than a snowflake. The world tilted. Suddenly, she was cradled against his chest, high off the cold ground, wrapped in his scent and his heat. Put me down, she tried to say, but it came out as a soft exhale against his neck. Sleep, little winter storm, he commanded. We have a long ride back to the capital. He turned and strode out of the cave, straight into the teeth of the blizzard. The wind hit them instantly, a shrieking wall of ice, but Draven didn't falter. He didn't even hunch his shoulders. It was as if the storm recognized him and parted around him, bowing to a superior force. He walked through the knee-deep snow with terrifying ease, carrying her toward a massive black shape waiting in the tree line, a warhorse, giant and dark as a nightmare, breathing plumes of steam into the frigid air. Eira struggled to keep her eyes open. The warmth radiating from Draven was seducing her into unconsciousness. It was a trap, she knew. If she slept, she would wake up in his cage. If she slept, she lost. But the bond was a heavy, lulling weight on her mind. It whispered that she was safe. It whispered that the monster holding her would tear the world apart before he let the cold touch her again. As he mounted the horse with effortless grace, settling her sideways in his lap, he pulled the heavy fur of his cloak around her, cocooning her in darkness against his chest. You ran from me, he murmured into the darkness of the cloak. His hand splayed possessively over her spine, holding her crushed against him. You made me hunt you. Do not think there will be no cost for that, Eira. Eira's heart gave a painful thud. What cost? She managed to whisper. He didn't answer immediately. The horse surged forward, powerful hooves eating up the snowy ground. Draven's grip on her tightened, just enough to bruise, just enough to remind her that she was captured. When we reach the Iron Citadel, he said, his voice vibrating through her ribs, I am going to lock you in my tower, and I am not going to let you out until you beg me to stay. The threat hung in the frozen air, heavy and promising. Eira tried to find the will to be angry, to be defiant, but the heat of him was seeping into her marrow, melting her resistance. As the darkness finally took her, the last thing she felt was his lips pressing a hard, claiming kiss to the top of her head. A seal on a warrant that had already been signed. Consciousness returned to Eira not as a flood, but as a slow, confusing drift through layers of unaccustomed warmth. She shouldn't be warm. The last truth she remembered was the biting cold of the mountain, the numbness that had turned her feet into blocks of wood, and the wind that had screamed like a dying god. But this was different. She was floating in a cloud of softness, furs that smelled of cedar and smoke, sheets of heavy linen that felt impossibly smooth against her skin. Her eyes snapped open. She wasn't in a cave. She was in a room carved from the black volcanic stone of the Obsidian Mountains, softened by tapestries of deep crimson. A fire roared in a hearth big enough to roast a stag, casting dancing shadows across the vaulted ceiling. Eira sat up, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. Panic seized her throat. She threw off the heavy furs and scrambled backward until her shoulders hit the carved headboard. You're awake! The voice came from the shadows near the fireplace. Eira flinched. Draven was sitting in a high-backed leather chair, a goblet of wine resting loosely in his hand. He had shed his heavy winter cloak, wearing a simple black tunic that did nothing to hide the terrifying width of his shoulders. The firelight played across his face, sharpening the angles of his jaw, and leaving only 2 burning points of gold watching her. "Where am I?" she demanded, hating how weak her voice sounded. "The Iron Citadel," Draven answered, his tone bored. "The West Tower, my private quarters." Private quarters. She looked down at herself and gasped. Her tattered, frozen clothes were gone. She was wearing a shift of fine white silk, thin enough that she could feel the heat of the room against her skin. Who changed me? She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling exposed. Draven took a slow sip of his wine. "My servants are efficient. Do not look so scandalized, Eira. You were unconscious, half frozen, and smelling of wet dog. You needed to be cleaned." "You had no right," she spat, sliding to the edge of the bed. "I have every right," he countered, the boredom vanishing, replaced by steel. "I am the king, and you are my mate. That gives me the right to keep you alive, even when you are stupid enough to try and freeze yourself to death." Eira's feet hit the stone floor. A mistake. Pain exploded up her legs, a searing, white-hot agony. She cried out, her knees buckling instantly. She didn't hit the floor. Draven moved with blurring speed. One moment he was by the fire. The next, he was catching her, his arms scooping her up before she could collapse. "Idiot," he growled, the vibration of his chest rumbling against her cheek. He carried her to the chair by the fire, depositing her onto the plush cushions. Before she could protest, he dropped to one knee in front of her. "Don't touch me," she hissed, trying to pull her legs back. His hand clamped around her ankle. It wasn't a hurtful grip, but it was absolute. He trapped her foot against his thigh. "Look at them, Eira." She looked. Her breath hitched. Her toes were a mottled, angry purple, swollen and ugly against the pale skin. Frostbite. "You nearly lost them," Draven said quietly. He reached for a small jar on the hearth, scooping out a pungent herbal salve. "I don't want your help. Be quiet." He began to massage the salve into her damaged skin. Eira bit her lip until she tasted copper. The sensation was overwhelming, a confusing mix of agony and relief. His hands, so large and capable of violence, were shockingly gentle. His thumbs worked the ointment into her flesh with a precision that bordered on reverence. The heat from his palms seeped into her cold bones, thawing the ice that still lingered in her marrow. It was intimate. Too intimate, to have the Alpha King kneeling at her feet, tending to her wounds. It unsettled her more than his threats. The heat of him was intoxicating, rolling off him in waves of cedar and power. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why do you care?" Draven didn't look up. "I know you are stubborn. I know you are a survivor. I know your scent drives my wolf to madness." He pressed his thumb into the arch of her foot, and a jolt of pleasure pain sparked up her leg. He stopped then. Slowly, he lifted his head. Those golden eyes locked onto hers, and the air in the room grew heavy, charged with static. "And I know," he whispered, "that if anyone else had made you run until your feet bled, I would tear their throat out with my teeth." Eira stopped breathing. The possessiveness in his gaze was terrifying. A raw, primal hunger. "I ran from you," she reminded him. "I know." His jaw tightened. "And now you are here, where you belong." He released her foot and stood up, the moment of vulnerability vanishing behind the mask of the king. "You will stay in this room," he commanded. "The door is locked. Do not try the window. It is a 200-foot drop." Eira glared at him. "So I am a prisoner?" "You are a guest who cannot be trusted." He walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the iron latch. The firelight caught the sharp curve of his cheekbone. "Rest, Eira. Heal. Tonight is the quietest night you will have." "Why?" she asked, dread pooling in her stomach. "Because tomorrow the pack arrives for the mating gathering," Draven said, his eyes darkening. "They will all want to see the female who made the king chase her into a blizzard. They will want to see if you are strong enough to stand beside me." He opened the door. "Are you?" "I'm not your mate," she said, lifting her chin. "And I don't care about your pack." Draven gave a short, humorless laugh. "Your body knows mine, little wolf. You can lie to yourself, but you cannot lie to the bond." He stepped out, and the heavy door slammed shut. The lock clicked into place, echoing like a gunshot. Eira was alone. She stared at the door, her heart racing, her feet throbbing with the ghost of his touch. She raised a hand to her chest. He was right. Her heart was beating a frantic rhythm that felt foreign, as if it were trying to sync with something else. She looked at the window, at the swirling snow. She was trapped in the tower of a monster who treated her wounds with the tenderness of a lover. And the worst part wasn't the fear. The worst part was that when his hands had been on her skin for just a second, she hadn't wanted him to stop. The dress was a weapon, not a garment. It was crimson velvet, the color of fresh arterial blood, heavy with gold embroidery that felt like armor against Eira's skin. The bodice was tight, pushing her breasts up and cinching her waist until breathing became a conscious, labored effort. "You look like a sacrifice," Eira whispered to her reflection in the polished silver mirror. Her hair had been braided with gold wire and rubies, pulled back to expose the vulnerable curve of her neck, a deliberate invitation, or perhaps a taunt. The bruising on her feet had faded to a dull yellow thanks to the king's salve, though she still felt the ghost of the frostbite in her toes. The heavy oak door opened without a knock. Draven entered. The air in the room changed instantly, becoming charged and thick. If Eira looked like a sacrifice, Draven looked like the deity coming to claim it. He wore formal blacks, a tunic of silk and leather that hugged the terrifying breadth of his chest, fastened with silver clasps shaped like wolves' heads. A heavy fur cloak, black wolf pelt, hung from his shoulders. He stopped in the center of the room, his golden eyes sweeping over her with a physical weight. He didn't smile. He didn't compliment her. He simply stared, his pupils dilating until the gold was nearly swallowed by black. "Turn around," he commanded. The voice was low, a rumble of thunder in a canyon. Eira stiffened. "I am not a show pony." "Turn around." She turned, slowly, hating the way her body responded to his authority. She felt him approach, the heat of him radiating against her back before he even touched her. His hands settled on her waist, the heavy velvet no barrier to the heat of his palms. He stepped closer, his chest brushing her shoulder blades. "They will try to break you tonight," he murmured against her ear. "The gathered alphas, the high-born families, they smell weakness like sharks smell blood. If you tremble, they will tear you apart." Eira shivered, leaning back slightly into his hardness. "Is that why you dressed me in red? So the blood won't show?" Draven's hands tightened, thumbs digging into her ribs. "I dressed you in red because it is the color of my house, and because it warns them that you are dangerous." He turned her around. The intensity in his gaze pinned her in place. He reached up, his rough knuckles grazing her jawline. For a heart-stopping second, she thought he would kiss her. Her lips parted, a treacherous invitation. He stared at her mouth, his gaze darkening with a hunger that bordered on pain. Then, with visible effort, he pulled back. "Do not leave my side," he said roughly, "and do not show fear." The great hall of the Iron Citadel was a cavernous maw of stone and shadow, lit by 1,000 beeswax candles. It smelled of roasting meat, strong wine, and the overpowering, musky scent of 500 wolves in human skin. When the herald announced King Draven and his guest, the noise was severed. 500 pairs of eyes turned to them. Eira felt the collective weight of their judgment like a physical blow. She gripped Draven's arm, her fingers digging into the leather. He was a rock, warm, solid, immovable. "Breathe," Draven whispered. As they reached the floor, the crowd parted like the sea before a storm. It wasn't respectful. It was wary. Eira saw sneers and looks of open disgust. She was an orphan, a runaway, a nobody wrapped in royal velvet. They knew it. "My king!" a voice boomed. A man stepped forward. He was massive, with white blonde hair and a face scarred by claws. He wore the gray and slate of the western peaks. "Torvin," Draven acknowledged, his voice cool and deadly. "You are far from your minds." Torvin didn't bow. He looked at Eira, his pale eyes raking over her with insulting slowness. "We came for the gathering to see the future of the North. We did not expect you to bring a stray dog to the high table." A gasp rippled through the room. Draven's body went rigid against hers. "Careful, Torvin, you speak of my guest." "I speak of a runt," Torvin spat, stepping closer. He smelled of sour sweat and aggression. "Look at her. She has no pack scent. She smells of fear and human blood. Is she even a wolf, Draven? Or have you taken a human pet to warm your bed?" The accusation hung in the air, toxic. If the pack believed she was human, she was dead. Eira felt the trembling start. She wanted to shrink, but she remembered his words. "If you tremble, they will tear you apart." She released Draven's arm. Draven looked down, surprise flickering in his eyes. Eira stepped forward, closing the distance between herself and the massive alpha. She forced her chin up. "I am Eira of the White Woods," she said. Her voice shook slightly, but she pushed power into it. "And I survived the blizzard that killed your trackers, Torvin. Did you?" The hall went deathly silent. Torvin's face turned mottled red. His lip curled back, revealing lengthened canines. "You dare speak to me, bitch?" "She speaks the truth," Draven said, stepping up behind her. His hand settling on the nape of her neck, a claim. "She survived where your strongest warriors failed." Torvin roared. It was a sound of pure, humiliated rage. He lunged. It happened in a blur. Torvin wasn't attacking Draven. He was attacking Eira. His clawed hand swiped for her face. Eira threw herself backward, catching her heel on her hem. She fell hard onto the stone. "I will not bow to a weakling!" Torvin screamed, eyes black. Draven collided with him. The impact shook the floor. Two massive bodies crashed into the banquet table, sending wine and meat flying. They rolled, a tangle of limbs and growls. Eira scrambled backward, heart hammering. She watched as Draven rose, lifting Torvin by the throat with one hand. Draven roared, a sound that shattered glass high above. "Enough!" He threw Torvin across the room. The massive alpha crashed into a stone pillar and slumped, wheezing. Draven stood in the wreckage, chest heaving. His claws were out. His eyes were glowing white fire. "She is mine!" he bellowed, the alpha command forcing weaker wolves to their knees. "Touch her, and you die!" Silence reclaimed the hall. But as Eira watched, terrified and awed by the monster defending her, she saw movement in the shadows of the upper balcony. A figure dressed in leather armor. The figure raised a crossbow. It wasn't aimed at Draven. It was aimed at her heart. "Draven!" she screamed, but the bolt was already loose. The sound of the crossbow bolt striking flesh was sickeningly wet, a heavy thud that stopped the world. Eira had frozen, watching death hurtle toward her. But death had been intercepted. Draven had moved with a speed that defied physics, placing his massive body between her and the balcony. The bolt, meant for her heart, was buried deep in his left shoulder, the black fletching vibrating from the impact. "Draven!" The name tore from her throat. The king didn't fall. He snarled, a sound of pure fury, and ripped the bolt from his own flesh in one violent motion. Black blood sprayed across the stone floor, hissing where it touched the ground. "Guards!" he roared. "Seal the exits!" Chaos erupted. The great hall dissolved into a frenzy. But Draven didn't join the fray. He turned to Eira, his face instantly pale, sweat beading on his forehead. "We move," he gritted out. "Now!" He grabbed her hand, his grip bruisingly tight, and pulled her toward a concealed door behind the high table. They plunged into a narrow stone corridor, leaving the riot behind. Draven stumbled, his heavy boots scuffing against the stone. The smell coming off him was wrong, acrid, like burning sugar and rot. "Draven, stop! You're hurt!" He pinned her against the rough wall. His eyes were wild, the gold swallowed by black pupils. "Wolfsbane," he choked out. "Concentrated, mixed with silver." Eira's stomach dropped. For a shifter, that combination was a death sentence. "We need a healer," she gasped. "No!" He leaned his forehead against the wall, trembling. "No healers. The assassin was inside the hall, inside the wards. I don't know who to trust." "Then where?" "My sanctuary, Upper Solar. Only I have the key." The climb was a nightmare. Draven's strength faded with every step. By the time they reached the heavy iron door at the top of the tower, Eira was practically carrying him. He fumbled a key, unlocked it, and they collapsed inside. It was a stark room. A bed, a table, a fireplace. A war room. Draven hit the floor hard. The wound on his shoulder was a puckered black hole oozing sludge. "Fire," he rasped, teeth chattering. "I need heat. Burn it out." Eira moved. She scrambled to the hearth, striking flint against steel until the kindling caught. Once the fire roared, she turned back. He was losing consciousness. "Draven, look at me. What do I do?" His eyes fluttered. "The dagger. Heat it. Cauterize." Eira stared in horror. "I can't." "You must," he growled, grabbing her wrist with a burning hand. "If the poison reaches my heart, I die, and if I die, they will kill you." The fear in his voice wasn't for himself. It was for her. That realization steeled her spine. She pulled the obsidian dagger from his sheath and thrust the blade into the heart of the fire, watching the stone turn red. "This is going to hurt," she whispered, tears blurring her vision. "Do it." Eira took a breath, pulled the glowing knife from the fire, and pressed it against the wound. Draven screamed. It was a sound of raw, animalistic agony. The smell of burning flesh filled the room. Eira gagged but held steady until the sizzling stopped. Draven slumped forward, unconscious. "Draven?" She dropped the knife. "Draven!" Silence. Eira stripped him of his tunic and boots, struggling to get his dead weight onto the rug before the fire. She covered him with furs, then curled up beside him, pressing her body against his side to share her warmth. He was freezing now, the fever breaking into a chill that shook his frame. "Don't you dare die," she whispered into his neck, her hand resting over his heart. It was beating, slow, heavy, irregular. Sometime deep in the night, he shifted. Eira jerked awake. The fire was embers. Draven was looking at her. His eyes were clear, the gold dull but present. "You stayed," he rasped. "Where else would I go?" she asked softly, brushing hair from his forehead. "It's a 200-foot drop." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. He captured her fingers, kissing her knuckles. "You saved me, Eira." "You took an arrow for me," she countered, throat tight. "Why?" Draven looked at her for a long time. The air shifted, becoming heavy with the hum of the bond. "Because," he whispered, pulling her hand to rest against the fresh scar. "I would rather bleed for 1,000 years than watch you fall." Eira's breath hitched. "You don't even like me. You locked me up." "I locked you up to keep you safe, and I failed." He tried to sit up, groaning. Eira helped him, her arm around his waist. He leaned his forehead against hers. "They want the throne, but they know they cannot beat me in combat, so they strike at my weakness." Eira stiffened. "Your weakness?" Draven looked at her mouth, his expression tortured. "You," he admitted. "The mate bond, it makes me vulnerable. If you die, I am destroyed. They know." He pulled away, his face hardening. "That is why you must leave, tonight. I will open the tunnels. You can run." Eira stared at him. He was giving her what she wanted. Freedom. "You're letting me go?" "I am saving you," he corrected, staring into the embers. "Go, Eira. Run far, and never look back." It was the noble choice. But before Eira could answer, the heavy iron door of the sanctuary, the door only Draven had a key to, clicked. The lock turned. Draven's head snapped up. He tried to rise, but his legs failed him. "No," he breathed. The door creaked open. Standing in the threshold wasn't a guard. It wasn't the assassin. It was Torvin, and behind him, smiling a smile that didn't reach her eyes, was a woman Eira recognized from the portraits, Draven's sister, Princess Lysandra. "Hello, brother," she purred, stepping into the room. "You look terrible." Draven roared, trying to shift, but the residual poison paralyzed him. He collapsed. Eira scrambled back, reaching for the dagger, but it was too late. "Grab the girl," Torvin ordered, his voice thick with satisfaction. "And kill the king." The room exploded into violence, but it was a slaughter. Not a fight. Eira didn't hesitate. Driven by an instinct she didn't know she possessed, she lunged at Torvin, the obsidian dagger raised high. She aimed for his throat, putting every ounce of her fear and rage into the strike. It was like a child attacking a mountain. Torvin didn't even flinch. His hand, thick as a sledgehammer, shot out and caught her wrist in midair. The impact was jarring. He squeezed. There was a sickening crunch. Eira screamed as the bones in her wrist ground together. Her fingers went numb, and the dagger clattered uselessly to the stone floor. "Feisty," Torvin grunted, his pale eyes alight with cruel amusement. He backhanded her. It was a casual blow for an alpha, but for Eira, it was devastating. The force of it lifted her off her feet and threw her across the room. She slammed into the heavy oak table. The breath driven from her lungs in a painful whoosh and crumbled to the floor. Black spots danced in her vision. She tasted blood, hot, metallic, and copious. "Eira!" Draven's voice was a wet, ragged sound. He was trying to crawl toward her. The Alpha King, the most powerful predator in the north, was reduced to dragging his paralyzed body across the rugs. The wolfsbane had stripped him of his strength, leaving him trembling. Lysandra watched him with a look of detached pity. She smoothed the skirts of her silver gown, the heavy scent of jasmine and rot wafting from her. "Oh, brother," she sighed, stepping over Eira's prone form. "Look at you, crawling for a stray." "Traitor," Draven snarled, his eyes flashing with a dim, dying gold light. "You lowered the wards." "I did," she admitted easily, "because you have become weak. You spare rebels. And now you bring this—" She gestured at Eira. "This nobody into our mother's halls." "She is my mate," Draven choked out. "She is a liability," Lysandra corrected sharply. She looked at Torvin. "Finish it. The council is waiting." Torvin grinned, revealing yellowed teeth. He stepped toward Draven. "No!" Eira forced herself up. Her head was spinning, but the sight of Torvin reaching for Draven ignited a fire in her blood. She threw herself at Torvin's legs, trying to anchor him. "Run, Draven!" she screamed. "Fight!" Torvin roared in annoyance. He kicked backward, his heavy boot connecting with Eira's ribs. Something cracked. The pain was blinding, a white-hot lance through her chest. She gasped, unable to draw breath, curling into a ball of agony. "Leave her," Lysandra commanded. "She is the witness we need!" Torvin reached down and grabbed Draven by the throat. He lifted the king into the air as easily as a rag doll. Draven clawed at Torvin's arm, but his grip was weak. "You were a great king once," Torvin sneered. "But winter has no mercy for the weak." He walked toward the open window. The blizzard howled outside, sending gusts of snow into the room. Eira watched through a haze of tears. She saw Draven's eyes lock onto hers. There was no fear in them. There was only an apology. and beneath the apology, a burning, desperate command. Survive. It wasn't spoken aloud, but she heard it in her mind, a final whisper of the bond before it was severed. "Long live the Queen!" Torvin bellowed. He threw Draven out into the void. "No!" The scream tore Eira's throat raw. She scrambled to the window ledge. She looked down. There was nothing but the swirling white vortex of the storm. The drop was 200 feet to the jagged rocks below. No one could survive it without shifting. And Draven couldn't shift. He was gone. A hollowness expanded in her chest, vast and terrible. The faint, humming connection she had felt for the last 24 hours snapped into silence. Tragic. Lysandra's voice came from behind her. The king, murdered by his own human pet. A crime of passion. Eira turned slowly. "You killed him." "I?" Lysandra laughed softly. "I am just a grieving sister. You are the savage found in his chambers with the murder weapon." She pointed to the obsidian dagger on the floor. "Torvin, take her to the dungeons." Torvin grabbed Eira by the hair, hauling her up. "Move, Kingslayer." Eira stumbled. Her mind was a loop of that final image. Draven's body disappearing into the white dark. They dragged her through the corridors of the citadel. She saw faces, servants, guards, blurring past. She heard gasps, shouts of alarm. "She killed him!" Torvin shouted to anyone who would listen. "She put a knife in the king while he slept! The witch!" The lie spread like wildfire. Eira could hear the confusion turning to hatred. They believed it. Why wouldn't they? She was the outsider. They reached the lower levels. Torvin opened a heavy iron grate and threw her inside. Eira hit the wet stone floor hard. The cell was pitch black, freezing and silent. "Rot here," Torvin spat. "Tomorrow you burn." The grate slammed shut. Eira lay in the dark. She was alone. The cold seeped into her broken ribs, but she couldn't feel it. She curled into a ball, pulling her knees to her chest. She closed her eyes and reached out with her mind, searching for that golden thread, that pulse of warmth. But the darkness didn't answer. The bond was silent. For the first time, Eira wished the cold would just take her. She buried her face in the dirty straw and let the darkness win. But deep in the silence, in the very back of her mind, she felt a flicker. Not a sound, just a tiny, impossible spark of rage. Time died in the dark. Eira didn't know if it had been hours or days since the grate slammed shut. The dungeon was a tomb of silence, broken only by the dripping of water and the scurrying of rats in the straw. The cold was absolute. It gnawed at her broken ribs, turning every shallow breath into a fresh stab of agony. She lay curled on the freezing stone, her eyes open but seeing nothing. He is gone. The thought was a jagged stone in her chest. Draven, the monster who had hunted her, the king who had claimed her, the man who had burned an arrow wound to save her. He had fallen into the white void, and he had taken her will to live with him. "Get up, witch!" The voice shattered her stupor. Light flooded the cell, blindingly bright, as the heavy iron door groaned open. Eira flinched, shielding her eyes with a trembling hand. 2 guards stood in the doorway. She didn't recognize them, but she recognized the crest on their tabards, Torvin's grey wolf. The coup was complete. The citadel belonged to the usurpers. "Lord Torvin wants her awake for the execution," the first guard sneered, kicking her leg. "Doesn't want her sleeping through the fire." Execution. Fire. The words floated through her mind like dead leaves, devoid of meaning. "She looks half dead already," the second guard muttered, stepping into the cell. He held a bucket of water. "Let's wake her up." He upended the bucket. Icy, filthy water crashed over her. The shock was electric. Eira gasped, her body seizing as the freezing liquid soaked her shift and ran into her wounds. She coughed, sputtering, trying to push herself up, but her arms were too weak. The guards laughed. "Look at her," the first one mocked. "The king's whore. Not so high and mighty now, is she?" He reached down, grabbing a fistful of her wet hair, and yanked her head back. "Where is your alpha now, little bitch? Where is the big bad wolf to save you?" Eira stared up at him. Hate, cold and sharp, began to crystallize in her gut. But beneath the hate, something else stirred. A pulse. It was faint. So faint she thought she imagined it. A tiny, rhythmic thrum in the base of her skull. It wasn't her heartbeat. It was slower, stronger. Thump, thump, thump. Her eyes widened. The bond. It wasn't severed. It was stretched, frayed, buried under pain and distance. But it was there. Eira rasped, her voice cracked and unused. "What's that?" The guard leaned in, grinning. "He's not dead." The guard snorted. "He fell 200 feet onto granite. He's meat for the crows." "No," she whispered. The conviction slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. The bond was holding on. He was holding on. Somewhere in the storm, broken and bleeding, Draven was alive. And if he was alive, she had to get to him. The realization snapped something inside her. The despair that had paralyzed her evaporated, replaced by a clarity that was terrifyingly cold. She looked at the guard holding her hair. She really looked at him. She saw the pulse in his neck. She saw the cruelty in his eyes. And she felt the cold. Not the cold of the dungeon. Her cold. It rose from the marrow of her bones, a sudden, violent drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the weather. The air in the cell shimmered. Frost began to bloom on the stone walls, spiderwebbing outward from where she knelt. "What the hell?" The guard dropped her hair, stepping back. He looked at his hand. His fingers were turning blue. "Why is it so cold?" "You asked where my alpha is," Eira said. She stood up. Her ribs screamed in protest, but she ignored them. The pain was distant now, muffled by the rising storm inside her blood. She wasn't just Eira of the White Woods anymore. She was something dormant that had finally woken up. "He is coming for you," she said, her voice echoing with a strange harmonic resonance. "But I am here now." The water on the floor began to freeze. It hissed, turning to ice in seconds. The bucket the second guard had dropped cracked as the water inside expanded violently. "She's doing something!" the second guard yelled, drawing his sword. "Kill her!" He lunged. Eira didn't think. She just reacted. She threw her hand out, palm open. A blast of wind, white with snow and hard as iron, exploded from her hand. It hit the guard in the chest like a battering ram. He flew backward, slamming into the stone wall with a bone-breaking crunch. He slid to the floor, unconscious, frost coating his armor. The first guard stared at her, his eyes bulging. "Sorcery! You're a witch!" "I am the winter," she whispered. He turned to run, but the floor was a sheet of ice. He slipped, crashing down hard. Before he could scramble up, Eira was on him. She grabbed the keys from his belt. Her touch burned him, not with heat, but with cold so intense it felt like fire. He screamed. "Quiet!" she commanded. She slammed the heavy iron keys into his temple. He went limp. Silence returned to the cell, but the air was different now. It crackled with power. Eira looked at her hands. They were glowing faintly, a soft, lunar white light pulsing beneath her skin. She didn't know what she was. She didn't know how she had done it, but she knew one thing. She wasn't helpless. She unlocked the cell door. The corridor outside was empty. The castle was asleep. Confident that the threat was contained. They were wrong. Eira moved. She didn't run. Her ribs wouldn't allow it, but she walked with a predator's purpose. She needed a weapon. She needed clothes. And then she needed to go into the storm. She found the guard room at the end of the hall. 2 men were sleeping at a table, dice scattered between them. Eira moved like a ghost. She bypassed them, snatching a heavy wool cloak and a short sword from the rack by the door. She stepped out into the courtyard. The blizzard was still raging. Good. The wind tore at the cloak she had stolen, but Eira didn't feel the chill. She felt welcomed. The snow swirled around her, not biting, but caressing. The storm was her ally. She closed her eyes, blocking out the pain, and focused on that tiny, rhythmic thrum in her mind. Where are you? She pushed the thought out, riding the bond. Faintly, weakly, an answer came. Not words. A sensation. Pain. Cold. And a direction. Down. He was in the ravine. Eira opened her eyes. They weren't brown anymore. In the reflection of a frozen puddle, she saw them, glowing with a pale white luminescence. She pulled the hood up. "Hang on, Draven," she whispered to the wind. "I'm coming." She slipped into the shadows, leaving the prison behind. She wasn't running away this time. She was going to hunt. The ravine was a grave, a jagged wound where the earth split open to reveal its black, frozen heart. The wind here didn't just blow. It shrieked, funneling through the narrow walls with enough force to strip flesh from bone. But it didn't strip hers. Eira climbed down the treacherous, icy rock face. The snow swirled around her in a chaotic vortex, but whenever she slipped, the wind seemed to push her back against the wall, an invisible hand steadying her descent. "I am coming!" she screamed silently into the bond. "Hold on!" The thread of connection was a lifeline of pain pulsing in the darkness below. She could feel his agony as if it were her own. Shattered bones, encroaching numbness, a fading heartbeat. It was a map drawn in suffering, and she followed it blindly. She reached the bottom. Here, the snow was deep, piled in drifts that would swallow a man whole. Eira waded through the waist-deep powder, her breath misting. She didn't feel the biting cold that should have been killing her. Instead, she felt a strange, humming energy in her veins. She smelled him before she saw him. Copper and pine, buried under the metallic tang of fresh snow. "Draven!" She scrambled over a pile of fallen scree. She found him at the base of a massive, ancient pine tree that had likely broken his fall and saved his life. Eira stopped, a sob catching in her throat. He was half buried in the snow, lying twisted at an unnatural angle. His body was a ruin. His left leg was bent wrong. His clothes were shredded, dark patches of frozen blood staining the black leather. His skin, usually so warm, was the color of ash. "No," she whimpered, falling to her knees. She frantically dug the snow away from his face. "Draven?" She placed her hands on his chest. It was still. Terror, cold and absolute, gripped her heart. "Don't you dare," she hissed, pressing her ear to his ribs. Then, thump. A long, terrifying pause. Thump. It was weak, erratic. But it was there. "You're alive," she breathed. She needed to get him warm. Now. The base of the pine tree created a small, sheltered hollow. It wasn't much, but it was out of the wind. "I have to move you," she told his unconscious form. "I'm sorry." She grabbed him under the arms. He was dead weight, massive and heavy, but the adrenaline gave her strength she shouldn't have had. She dragged him, gritting her teeth inch by inch into the shelter of the tree. He groaned, a low, pained sound, but didn't wake. Once inside, Eira worked quickly. She stripped off her stolen cloak and laid it over him. It wasn't enough. He was freezing to death. His shifter healing couldn't work if his body had no energy. She did the only thing she could. She crawled under the furs with him. She pressed her body against his, aligning her small frame with his massive, broken one. She wrapped her arms around his torso, careful of his ribs, and buried her face in his neck. "Wake up," she whispered against his cold skin. "Come back to me." She closed her eyes and visualized the heat inside her. Not the cold magic, but the warmth of the bond. She imagined her life force pouring into him, a river of light fighting back the gray. Minutes passed. They felt like hours. She felt him before he moved, a hitch in his breathing, a subtle shift in the tension of his muscles. "Eira?" The name was a broken rasp. Eira pulled back slightly. His golden eyes were open, slits of molten light in the darkness. They were unfocused, glazed with pain, but they were looking at her. "I'm here," she choked out, cupping his jaw. "I've got you." Draven stared at her as if she were a hallucination. "Dead?" he murmured. "Not yet. You survived the fall." A spasm of pain crossed his face. "My legs." "Broken. But you're healing. It's slow, but it's happening." He forced his eyes open again. Clarity returned, warring with shock. "You came for me." "I told you," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm not leaving you." "Why?" "Because you're mine," the words tumbled out, "and I'm yours." Draven let out a breath that turned into a cough. Blood bubbled at the corner of his mouth. Eira wiped it away. "My brave little rabbit," he wheezed. "Foolish." He leaned into her touch, eyes fluttering shut. "Tired." "I know. Sleep. I'll watch." "No," he mumbled, fighting the darkness. "Not safe. Torvin. He will send the hounds." Eira froze. The hounds. The elite tracking unit. Monstrous shifters bred for hunting who never lost a scent. "Let them come," she said, though her heart hammered. Draven's breathing leveled out as he slipped back into unconsciousness. Eira held him tighter, listening to the wind howl. But then, beneath the wind, she heard it. It started low, a mournful sound that rose in pitch until it became a terrifying, harmonized cry echoing off the canyon walls. Howls, not the wild howls of wolves. The rhythmic baying howls of a hunting party that had found a trail. They weren't coming. They were already here. Eira looked at the opening of their shelter. The storm was clearing, and in the distance, against the white snow, she saw shadows moving, fast, too fast to be human. She looked down at Draven, broken and helpless in her arms. She had saved him from the fall. Now she had to save him from the pack. Eira reached for the short sword she had stolen, gripping the hilt. Then she let go. Steel wouldn't save them against 5 alphas. She looked at her palms. She concentrated on the cold, on the winter living in her blood. "Wake up, Winter," she whispered. "We have company." The hounds did not bark. They flowed over the snow like oil. 5 massive shapes, darker than the night, with eyes that burned with a chem-green luminescence. These were not natural wolves. They were monsters broken and remade by Torvin's alchemy, stripped of everything but hunger. Eira stood at the entrance of the hollow. She felt small, fragile, a snowflake standing against an avalanche. But beneath her skin, the strange, cold rhythm pounded like a war drum. Protect him. The first hound lunged. It moved with terrifying speed, aiming for her throat. Eira didn't think. She felt. She threw her hands up, palms out, screaming a wordless command. The air in front of her didn't just freeze. It solidified. A jagged wall of translucent blue ice erupted from the ground. The hound slammed into it face first with a sickening crack, sliding down the barrier, stunned. The other 4 skidded to a halt, claws tearing deep gouges in the snow, confused by the magic radiating from the small female. "Leave us," Eira warned, her voice amplified by the wind. "Or I will bury you." The leader, a beast scarred from nose to tail, snarled. He signaled the others. They fanned out, circling the tree. They attacked all at once. Panic flared in Eira's chest. She spun, tracking their movements. One broke through the branches on the left. Eira lashed out with her mind. The snow beneath the beast's paws turned to liquid, then instantly flash froze, trapping its legs. It howled as the ice snapped shut, but 2 more were coming from the right. Eira turned, but she was too slow. A heavy body slammed into her side. She went down hard, the breath knocked from her lungs. Hot, fetid breath washed over her face. Snapping jaws inches from her throat. She screamed, flailing, her hand connecting with the creature's fur. Freeze. She channeled every ounce of terror into her palm. The beast convulsed, turning into a statue of frost in seconds. Its heart stopped, frozen solid. The heavy carcass collapsed on top of her. Eira shoved it off, gasping, scrambling to her knees. Her vision swam. The magic was draining her life force rapidly. She was cold, too cold, even for her. She looked up. The leader had bypassed her. He was at the entrance of the hollow, his head lowered, ready to drag Draven out. "No!" Eira reached out, but her energy sputtered. She was empty. The leader lunged into the dark space beneath the tree. A roar shook the ground. It wasn't the hound. A hand, bloodied, bruised, but still terrifyingly large, shot out from the darkness. It grabbed the hound by the throat mid-leap. Draven. He dragged himself into the light. He looked like a corpse resurrected by pure rage. His leg dragged uselessly behind him, and his chest was a map of agony, but his eyes were burning gold. "Mine," he snarled. With a surge of alpha power that defied his injuries, Draven squeezed. There was a wet snap. He threw the dead hound aside like a rag doll, but the effort cost him. He slumped against the tree trunk, wheezing, his skin gray. The last remaining hound, the largest of the pack, was stalking toward them, sensing their exhaustion. "Draven!" Eira gasped, crawling to his side. I don't have enough magic left." Draven looked at her. His hand found hers, gripping it hard. "You do," he rasped. "You just need an anchor." He pulled her closer, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that burned. "The bond," he whispered. "Open it. All of it. Don't fight me, Eira. Let me in." Eira looked at the approaching beast, then at Draven. She had been resisting the bond since the beginning, afraid of losing herself. But looking at him now, broken for her, fighting for her, she realized she wouldn't lose herself. She would complete herself. She closed her eyes and tore down the walls in her mind. Take it. She didn't just open the door. She flooded the connection. She poured her winter, her rage, and her fear into him. And he answered. He poured his strength, his fire, and his ancient alpha authority into her. The sensation was blinding. It was like breathing pure oxygen after a lifetime of holding her breath. The pain in her ribs vanished. The exhaustion evaporated. Draven's eyes flared with blinding light. Eira's eyes glowed a stark, lunar white. They moved as one. Draven raised his hand. Eira raised hers. They didn't need to speak. Their wills were braided together, a double helix of power. The last hound leaped. "Freeze!" they commanded in unison. It wasn't a blast of ice. It was the absolute cessation of heat. The air in the ravine dropped to absolute zero in a heartbeat. The leaping hound didn't just freeze. It turned to glass in midair. Its momentum carried it forward, and it crashed into the ground at their feet. Shatter. The beast exploded into 1,000 glittering shards of red-tinted ice. Silence fell over the ravine. The wind died down, bowing to its masters. Eira slumped against Draven's chest, panting. But this time, she wasn't cold. She was burning with the heat of the bond. Draven wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her neck. He inhaled deeply, the sound vibrating through her bones. "You are..." He pulled back to look at her, his expression one of reverence and shock. "You are a winterborn. The legends, they said your kind was extinct." "I don't care about legends," Eira whispered, touching the healing bruise on his jaw. "I just care that you're alive." Draven captured her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. Then he looked at his leg. "The magic," he noted, flexing his knee. "It accelerated the healing. I can stand. He used the tree to pull himself up. He was still limping, still battered, but he was standing. He was the king again. He looked up at the cliff edge, 200 feet above them. Somewhere up there, in the warmth of the citadel, Torvin and Lysandra were celebrating their victory. Draven extended his hand to Eira. "They think we are dead," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "They think the winter has claimed us." Eira took his hand. She felt the power humming between them, a circuit that would never be broken again. She looked at the shattered remains of the hounds, then up at the unforgiving climb that awaited them. Her eyes narrowed, glowing with cold light. "They're right," she said, a cruel smile touching her lips. "The winter has claimed us, and now we are going to claim them." Draven pulled her to his side, his arm heavy and possessive around her waist. "Let's go home, my queen," he growled. "We have a throne to take back." The great hall of the iron citadel echoed with the laughter of traitors. Torvin lounged on the obsidian throne, a goblet of stolen wine in his hand, while Lysandra stood beside him, smiling at the gathered lords. "To the new era," Torvin toasted, sloshing wine onto the stone. "And to the memory of the fallen king, may he rot in the ravine." The candles lining the walls flickered and died. The temperature plummeted, turning breath to mist. The massive double doors didn't just open, they shattered. Splinters of oak flew across the room as a gale of biting wind roared in. In the swirling vortex of snow, 2 figures emerged from the shadows. Draven walked in first. His limp was gone. His presence was a physical weight that slammed into every shifter in the room, forcing the air from their lungs. His eyes were no longer dim. They blazed with the blinding gold of a star. Beside him walked Eira. Frost coated the floor with every step she took. Her eyes glowed with a terrifying, lunar white light. "You're sitting in my chair," Draven said. His voice was quiet, yet it drowned out the wind. Torvin scrambled up, dropping his goblet. "Ghosts!" he shrieked. "Guards! Kill them!" 50 guards lined the walls. Not one moved. They were frozen by instinct, pinned by the alpha power rolling off the king and the terrifying magic of the Winterborn. "They cannot hear you, Torvin," Eira said softly. She raised a hand. The spilled wine at Torvin's feet hissed and flash froze into jagged red spikes. "Sorcery!" Lysandra screamed. She grabbed a heavy crossbow from a nearby table, aiming it at Eira's heart. "Die, witch!" Draven didn't flinch. He didn't even look at his sister. Eira merely looked at the weapon. "Put it down!" Frost raced across the crossbow, welding the mechanism shut and burning Lysandra's hands with cold. She screamed, dropping the useless weapon as ice encased her fingers. "I am the storm, Lysandra," Eira whispered. "You cannot shoot the winter." Torvin roared, panic overriding his senses. He shifted, bones cracking as he exploded into his massive gray wolf form. He lunged at Draven, a desperate attempt to reclaim power through blood. Draven didn't shift. He didn't need to. He caught the massive wolf in midair by the throat. With a roar that shook the foundations of the citadel, Draven slammed Torvin into the stone floor. The impact cracked the flagstones. Draven held the thrashing alpha down with one hand, his grip absolute. I gave you mercy once, Draven snarled, leaning over the traitor. But you touched my mate. Draven's claws lengthened. And for that, there is no mercy. He tore Torvin's throat out. It was quick, brutal. The gray wolf twitched once, then went still. Draven stood up, blood dripping from his hand. He looked at the trembling court. Kneel, he commanded. It wasn't a request. It was gravity. 500 wolves dropped to their knees. Foreheads touched the stone. The submission was total. Draven turned to Eira. The rage in his eyes melted into adoration. He held out his bloody hand. Eira took it. He led her up the stairs to the dais, turning her to face the room. Behold, Draven announced, Eira of the White Woods, the Winterborn, your queen. A cheer started, low and hesitant, then grew into a roar that shook the banners. Long live the queen! Long live the king! Epilogue. The storm had finally passed. The moon hung high over the iron citadel, bathing the private balcony of the west tower in silver light. Eira stood at the railing, wrapped in a robe of white silk. Her wrist was healed. Her ribs no longer ached. But the cold magic still hummed beneath her skin, a part of her now. Strong arms wrapped around her waist. She leaned back into the solid warmth of him. Draven buried his face in her neck, inhaling deeply. He smelled of soap and cedar. The blood of the battle washed away. You are thinking too loud, he murmured against her skin. I'm thinking about the quiet, she admitted, covering his hands with hers. I never thought I'd hear it again. Peace is noisy in its own way, Draven said. He kissed her shoulder, his hold tightening. The council is terrified of you. They say you have ice in your veins. Eira smiled, turning in his arms. And what do you say? Draven looked down at her. The golden fire in his eyes burned with a steady, enduring heat. He cupped her cheek, his thumb tracing her lip. I say you are the fire that melted the winter, he whispered. That's terrible poetry, my king. I am a warrior, not a bard, he chuckled, the sound rumbling against her chest. But I know the truth. You saved me, Eira. In every way a man can be saved. Eira reached up, tangling her fingers in his hair. The bond between them sang, a perfect, harmonious chord. We saved each other, she corrected. Draven kissed her. It wasn't the frantic kiss of survival, but the slow, deliberate kiss of a promise kept. When he pulled back, he rested his chin on her head, looking out over the snow-covered kingdom that was now theirs. Are you happy, little rabbit? He asked, the old nickname now spoken with infinite tenderness. Eira looked at the moon. She thought of the cold cave where she had started, and the warm arms that held her now. She wasn't running anymore. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. I'm not a rabbit anymore, Draven, she whispered, her eyes glowing with starlight. Draven grinned, pulling her toward the warmth of their bedchamber. No, he agreed, closing the balcony doors against the night. You are the Wolf Queen, and I am entirely at your mercy. The The doors clicked shut, sealing them in their sanctuary, leaving the cold world outside and keeping the warmth where it belonged, between them.